So I've been stuck on the script for this video for months now. I have hundreds of pages of notes and bookmarks and annotations. And if you know Earl Sweatshirt, you know why. Earl's a monster with the pen. And despite his new album only being 24 minutes long, it's so layered with meaning, I thought I'd never be able to single out one idea to discuss. Until I made a discovery, or maybe a delusion, you can keep watching to decide. This album is in part a dialogue with JPEGMAFIA, not only in respect to his comments earlier this year about Earl making the same song for the last 20 years, but also as a response to Peggy's last album, I Lay Down My Life For You, and his recent career choices of working with Kanye. And we're not talking about a handful of subliminals. A decent portion of this album's message seems to specifically target JPEG. This has largely gone over everyone's heads. Earl says as much on his feature on California Games by Arm & Hammer. But it's not really a surprise that Earl has handled their differences this way. Earl has no appetite for beef. His appeals to Peggy are less in the spirit of beef and more in the form of just general critiques and advice. So join me as we pick apart Earl Sweatshirt's latest project and try to understand the core of the message that he wants to leave his fans and his adversaries with. Welcome back to Ray Garish. Many reviewers and analysts have already pointed out how Live, Laugh, Love serves as a companion piece of sorts to 2018's Some Rap Songs. And it's easy to see why. I mean, if you just compare the album covers, we've got a similar color palette and also a 3-word title. The key difference is the framing. We have mental distortion and psychosis in Some Rap Songs, but relative clarity and lucidity in Live, Laugh, Love. However, I'd like to suggest that Live, Laugh, Love also functions as a response to I Lay Down My Life For You, JPEGMAFIA's 2023 studio album. Consider the titles, not just the similar alliteration of the L, mind you. At the core of each of these albums is the theme of life and death. But whereas in Live, Laugh, Love, Earl has found stability and community, Peggy's album is a portrait of someone who is outwardly brash and antagonistic, but inwardly insecure, broken, and emotionally scarred. As shown on the closer, I recovered from this and the frequent lyrics about heavy substance use and meaningless sex. Also, notice how both albums have tracks that are stylized in a variety of uppercase, lowercase, and numerical combinations. Let's dive into some of these tracks though, because a lot of that's just surface level stuff and you could put that down to coincidence or general stylistic choice. I think the best place to start is by figuring out who Leonidas is on the track Infatuation. Trying to figure out who Leonidas was in this line drove me mad when trying to unpack this song, until I rewatched the final scene of the movie 300. Just listen to these lines from the closing speech where a soldier addresses the Spartan army following Leonidas' death. From free Greek to free Greek, the word has spread that bold Leonidas and his 300, so far from home, laid down their lives. If you're not convinced yet, draw your attention to this particular line that Peggy spits off of the director's cut of I Lay Down My Life For You. Now, technically, the Roman here is referencing Roman Reigns, the WWE legend. However, I'd argue that Earl flips this line to characterize JPEGMAFIA as Leonidas, leader of the 300. It would make sense for Earl to do this, since the line does literally ask for it to be acknowledged. Y'all better acknowledge it. And before you say, oh, but Leonidas was Greek, he wasn't Roman, ask yourself who else confused the Greeks and the Romans when meaning to refer to the Spartans. Keep in mind that a reference to the 300 Spartans also has the connotations of the military, masculinity, bravado, strength, homoeroticism. I wonder who embodies many of these ideas. Let's pick apart the first lines from Infatuation. Exonerated, I ain't dying on this hill. Tonight we dining where? Tell Leonidas I know somewhere with finer fares. Exonerated means to be released from the grip of something. I would interpret this as Earl referring to overcoming his demons. However, the line dying on this hill, followed by the metaphor of dining, refers to Earl's lack of interest or drive to engage with this beef that Peggy is clearly trying to fire up. Finer fares refers to better places to eat, or that Earl has better things to do than getting into beef. The next line, germinate the yeast, we got it jumping out the pan, uses yeast as a metaphor for the success that both Peggy and Earl have earned. Yeast is the key ingredient in bread, and bread is common rap slang for money. However, the jumping in the pan spins the symbol of yeast to likely also represent Earl and Peggy's extraordinarily white fan base, specifically within the context of a mosh pit or something similar. I say mosh pits because they are notoriously foul-smelling, just like yeast is when activated. Also, yeast is pale in color, just like their Caucasian fan base. This is basically an incredibly poetic way of Earl addressing how both him and JPEGMAFIA have achieved their wealth, success, and fame through appealing to young, white, stinky men like myself. The next three lines are a beautiful illustration of how Earl and Peggy have overcome the trauma of their youths and become beasts in their own right. And this next set of lines alludes to the comments that Peggy made about Earl not innovating or pushing boundaries. Earl essentially dismisses this comment by saying that Peggy is just as guilty of not innovating. However, Earl also gracefully adds the bit about the rocky path. Earl is reminded of his own troubles by JPEG's behavior. Maybe he even sees parallels in their journeys. Earl is saying that the only reason Peggy is talking smack is that he hasn't fully dealt with his issues yet. Later in the track, Earl addresses Peggy's critical comments from earlier this year more offhandedly in the line, "Have lil' buddy relax, we on the cutting edge." The line, "Told you we only doubling back to cover tracks," again refers to Peggy's claim that Earl's music is repetitive and stagnant. He uses the metaphor of doubling back to refer to how vocals are recorded more than once in order to be layered on songs, as well as walking over your footprints again to purposefully distort them so that you can't be tracked. Earl's basically saying that he is innovative and is constantly growing as an artist, even if the legacy he's leaving may not be as noisy, theatrical, or showy as what Peggy is doing. His footprint will likely take a little longer to be recognized and fully appreciated. In the line, "Nobody wants the scraps," the scraps could refer to fights or arguments, Earl basically saying that he does not want to get into beef. But also, I think this is a bit of a dig at JPEG releasing a lot of his throwaway songs, like his re-released material and director's cut albums, which contrasts pretty starkly with Earl's consistently more trim approach to releasing records. I really love this line where Earl is quite poetically portraying his hunger for rapping, and the question that follows, "Tonight we dining where?" shows that as hungry as Earl is, he has greener pastures to graze at and doesn't really want to engage. Okay, before we move on, I want to briefly dissect the whole Spartan military lens that Earl employs on this track. If you've been following so far, Earl selects this metaphor because it quite succinctly conveys JPEGMAFIA's unchecked aggression, military background, homoerotic undertones, and the legacy of industrial hip-hop established by bands like Death Grips and albums like Yeezus that have obviously had an impact on Peggy. But I actually think the metaphor goes deeper than this. Remember that Leonidas and the Greek/Roman Empire more broadly has been hijacked and reappropriated by the right wing as a symbol of Western might and glory. With JPEGMAFIA collaborating with Kanye and intentionally using racist or conservative symbols, I think Earl is also commenting on how Peggy has increasingly aligned himself with what many would characterize as anti-blackness. If you think that's a stretch, Just keep this theory in mind as we move on to the next song, Gamma, a track where Earl reiterates his connection to his community and aligns himself with figures like De La Soul and Roy Ayers, while referring to his rival using the more white or mainstream reference points, James Cameron, Stephen King, and the German horror movie Funny Games. Peggy often uses white cultural references in his own music, so that adds another layer to the dynamic here. Earl's message here is clear. His lyricism, writing, and style follows the respected traditions of hip-hop, established by the likes of De La Soul and Wu-Tang Clan, whereas his opponent's artistic legacy is more in line with Western sensibilities. To add another layer to the messaging, the song that Earl is referencing with the Gamma title is the De La Soul song Much More, which specifically covers the subject matter of materialistic rappers who do not have the same substantive artistry that De La Soul does. On the following song, Well Done, lyrics like these have Earl looking back on the turbulence of his youth through the metaphor of storms or maelstroms, a recurring image throughout the album. He reminds us that he emerged from these internal and external battles victorious. Orion-sized is a reference to the Greek myth of Orion. Orion in the myth is honored by being given a constellation. Part of the constellation includes the 3 stars from Orion's belt, and heavyweight fighters are the largest, beefiest, meatiest fighters of the whole bunch. Hey, wasn't there an album recently that featured an artist brandishing a belt? Now, I must be misremembering that, couldn't. Yes. Earl extends the storm metaphor while switching to second-person perspective to address his unnamed rival. Check out these lines. Sales could be a homophone for sales, as in album sales, while also referring to the sails of a ship that you have to man in order to get your boat to move. Earl depicts his desire to protect his community, ending the track with the image of steel-cut knives crossed against a shield, followed by the fragmented and ambiguous phrase, spill blood. The theme of protecting your community is reinforced by the sample that pops in at this point. I'll link where the sample is from in the description so you can go watch it yourself, but it's basically an old documentary that shows a Haitian voodoo priest, or Legba, his apprentice and his assistants as they engage in a ritual or ceremony with their community, where the Legba, the priest, acts as an intermediary between the physical and the spiritual worlds. This harkens back to the start of the track, where Earl depicts himself as spiritually enlightened and divinely inspired. Now, I want to get into some details regarding this particular voodoo ceremony, but I want to note that I'm not an expert, but I do know that these belief systems have been very unfairly and violently demonized by colonialism, so please do grant me some grace, but also know that we need to throw everything we think we know about voodoo or African diaspora religions generally out of the window, especially if you look like me. So the ritual in the sample here is referred to as the Rada rites, and it's centered around the priest or Legba. The central symbol in the Rada rites is the crossroads, which is signified by the drawing of a cross either in the ground, in the dirt, or in the air. As a side note, crosses feature really heavily in I Lay Down My Life For You. There's also crosses on the Scaring the Hose album cover, incidentally. Notice though how JPEG ties his cross to Western and Arabic influences and frames them in a nihilistic light, demonstrated in the many lines where he raps about not being able to see or know God, whereas Earl, conversely, portrays himself as a spiritual leader in his community, shown in the line, honorary chief watching over proceedings, from heavy metal. Back to the ritual. Once the crossroads are drawn in the ground, the Legba engages in a ritual battle with his apprentice, who brandishes a sword and is flanked on either side by women from the congregation. The Legba represents the gods among the congregation, while the apprentice with the sword and the 2 flag bearers represent the community. The mock battle ends with the apprentice honoring the Legba by kissing the earth he stands on, while the priest honors the strength of the congregation by kissing the hilt of the sword and the tops of the flags. The ceremony also involves the beheading of chickens. Keep in mind this image of beheading because it'll feature in the tracks Live and Forge. Here's my take on what the inclusion of this ceremony means. Earl is comparing himself to the Legba as an intermediary with the divine and a beacon of hope to his community. This idea is supported by other lyrics throughout the album referring to Earl's spiritual position, as well as the fact that the figure of Papa Legba from these belief systems is often depicted as a facilitator of communication who regularly smokes and uses drugs to access the spiritual world. It sounds an awful lot like Earl to me. The sample in Well Done ends with a slight reverse before segueing into Live. Live really stands out in the track list as it has a beat switch halfway and stylistically has more in common with some rap songs than the other tracks here on Live, Laugh, Love, with Earl reminiscing about the past and sounding quite druggy and disassociated. I think we can interpret this as him entering a drug-like state in order to commune with the gods and share that wisdom with his community. But if you read into the lyrics, you'll discover that Earl in verse 1 threatens to behead his competition, and then makes good on that threat at the end of the second verse, where he coldly states, "I cut off the stem, I saw the death blooming," and the same Brazil audio sample that JPEGMAFIA used on I Lay Down My Life For You. Here's my take. Earl, within his role as the Legba, is performing a spiritual beheading of sorts. This would explain why the decapitation is characterized using the metaphor of a flower. It is not a head that is being decapitated. It is the ego. Now, this beheading could be of Earl himself, a killing of his old self, the part of him still in the void, lost in the darkness of his depression. But then why are there these bars where Earl is exasperated at someone else? My reading is that this decapitation is most likely of JPEG's ego. Keep in mind that the Legba engages in their ceremonies musically. This also explains these lines where Earl once again asserts his status as king along with the Wu-Tang nod. I'd like to keep running with this motif of beheading in Forge, but let's quickly get track 1 out of the way. Golden State Warriors versus Sacramento Kings. First, notice how both teams in the title are California-based teams, emphasizing the idea of more local, friendly competition. The fact that one of the teams is Kings, whereas the other is Warriors, hints at Earl and Peggy's friendly rivalry, with Earl in this album and his previous albums referring to himself using the King title. Comparatively, the Warrior title is more aligned with Peggy, along with the Leonidas comparison and all the military terminology. Warrior kind of fits into that. There are allusions to items associated with warfare, like the blade, Earl being decorated like a soldier, the blood, sweat, and pain, but these symbols are inverted to be less militaristic and more in line with sports. This is a friendly game, with Earl even giving praise to his competition. Notice also how Earl establishes the symbol of roses to refer to his flowers. In other words, the fame, success, love, and acclaim that he has received as an artist. The flowers, just like in Live, are a symbol of the ego. And there's also a cheeky reference to the good bud that Earl is puffing on the album cover. Note also the theme of slow, gradual, constructive progress being better than rushing ahead. Something Earl touches on with the metaphor of getting your sails up in Well Done. Earl's message to his competition and his listeners is that wanting to be on the cutting edge, wanting to be the best and sort of rushing ahead without looking inward, is dangerous. This harmful chasing activity is linked to the recurring motif of the storm or hurricane, as well as activities like excessive drinking, reckless spending, and avoiding commitment. All activities we can associate with JPEGMAFIA, as outlined on his track, I Recovered From This. Okay, here's the juicy bit though. Earl name drops Tay Hicks, aka Neon Tay, and a line he has on his song, Thank Allah. Let's pull up the lines that Earl is actually referencing here. If you can't tell, we have a couple of shots at JPEG. The fellatio mentioned is likely a reference to JPEGMAFIA's Ghost Pop movie, where you can see footage of, well, you know. Combine that with the references to Preacher Man, a dope boy, a soldier. So Neon Tay's song came out in April 2023. At the beginning of 2025, this year, JPEGMAFIA would release Allah off the director's cut of his latest studio album. And there's a line off of that song that I want you to keep in mind. You step up to the sword, you're gonna die by the steel it was forged with. With that JPEG line in mind, I think you can understand why this motif of blades, knives, swords, and metal more generally is so prevalent on Live, Laugh, Love. It also makes sense because JPEGMAFIA's most recent album was his most metal-inspired yet. So with that forge line in mind, let's move on to the next track on Live, Laugh, Love, A Forge. We have the line in the refrain, the head was on a stick where it belonged. A head on a stick is a somewhat abstract way of referring to how a decapitated head is historically placed on a pole or spike as a war trophy. It's basically a pretty effective don't fuck with me sign. But why is Earl referring to a head on a stick? If you guessed that it's a JPEGMAFIA reference, you're 100% correct. So, back in 2016, Peggy uploaded a track to YouTube titled Kid Rock Freestyle 2014. The song is a diss towards Kid Rock, infamous conservative rap rock cringe lord who made these blisteringly racist comments about Beyonce. Peggy's track is a violent, visceral attack on Kid Rock, threatening him in a variety of ways. He is basically hunting Kid Rock down and sending him to the big plantation in the sky. Okay, but why is Earl referencing these lines? JPEG has drifted pretty far from this kind of revolutionary, violent rhetoric and now seems to embrace Hollywood and racist celebrities like Kid Rock. He let his principles slide for the sake of fame. He went from I don't want to be a star in this song to I love Hollywood and fake tits on his last album. This context helps make more sense of lines like this from Static, where Earl is taunting an unnamed adversary for not being politically engaged, despite everything happening in America right now. And lines like this from Forge make a lot more sense with this context too. I gather you didn't hunt at all. Peggy never made good on his promise of this sort of a violent demonstration. There's some other digs here. The salt in Peggy's biscuits throwing the mix off is a cheeky dig at Peggy's production, which he famously mixes and masters himself, as well as this accusation that Peggy bit off Earl, and this line, which is essentially Earl reiterating his status as king of the genre. What isn't ours is rhetorical. Earl is commenting on the movement he has created in hip-hop, headed up by the likes of him, Mike, and Navy Blue. Slivers of God ad infinitum is Earl commenting on the everlasting legacy that he leaves on the genre. He's deliberately comparing his legacy with JPEG's and saying, bro, you just can't compare. There's also some sly references to the JPEGMAFIA song Kingdom Hearts Key, and a continuation of the theme from the previous track regarding how Earl has grown and has momentum in his career, whereas his ops are stagnant. The final two tracks are the only other notable songs that address or mention Peggy in a substantive way. Heavy Metal is the glistening, euphoric penultimate track that has Earl blissfully celebrating the release of his album. But I think in a meta way is also referring to the release of negativity that the earlier darker tracks on the album feature, as well as him addressing the contention between him and Peggy. Heavy metals are toxic, after all. The fact that the song is so soulful and blissful while being titled Heavy Metal is also definitely intentional. Earl might be poking fun at Peggy's last album, which, as we mentioned, was his most metal inspired. The second verse has Earl pleading. It's unclear who Earl is addressing, but the mention of "I saw you jogging" and the "jog my memory" line from Forge, as well as the "running" mentioned in track 1, and all the LA/California mentions with Earl living there, I think this could refer to an instance where Earl literally saw Peggy jogging in Los Angeles. It would also explain why Earl once again uses that Brazil audio clip at the end of the song here. We're definitely in like tinfoil hat territory though, so let's close things off with Earl's most sincere call to action, the closing track, Exhaust. You know how the previous track has the alternative title of Ejectocito in reference to that Fast and Furious scene where the dude gets like ejected out the car? Well, you can interpret exhaust as Peggy figuratively being left in the dust as Earl drives off into the distance. As a fun extra meaning, car exhausts also release heavy metals. Earl is basically detoxifying himself from the bullshit. This explains Earl's relieved, assertive tone in the song because he's won the fight and now he's driving off into the sunset. Earl is at his most direct in this track, but he's not antagonistic. He's instructive. He's got some advice for Peggy. His first piece of advice is to quit drinking alcohol, something he himself did prior to working on this album. Peggy himself admits to alcohol giving him a lens on the closing track of his album, I Recovered From This. Notice how both songs feature prominent female vocal loops and have titles that are stylized in lowercase. Earl makes sure to include the word veteran in the song to catch Peggy's attention, but interestingly inverts it to be more applicable to someone like Billy Woods or The Alchemist. In this context, it's a cheeky way of saying that they are the rap veterans and not Peggy. There's also the continued use of the military motifs to reinforce exactly who Earl is speaking to here. Earl's second piece of advice is that Peggy needs to open his heart to someone and settle down, which we can see in this particularly blunt lyric here, which interpolates "fucking problems" by A$AP Rocky featuring Kendrick and Drake. Both latter artists happen to be referenced throughout I Lay Down My Life For You. Earl is likely highlighting how this inability to settle down is making Peggy miserable, and that Peggy just needs to settle down and find someone to love, just like Mandel says on the opening track. The final few lines of the album are some of Earl's most potent. "More power to you, but there's no flowers in your vase." Here, Earl draws from the flower motif that we've seen throughout the album. It's one of the most brutal, cutting lines that Earl delivers, made all the more heartfelt by the audible empathy in Earl's voice. The next line, "No amount of sugar gonna help with the taste," reinforces the advice laid out. Earl has historically used sugar as a stand-in for liquor, and sugar could also refer to the sexual company of female. No amount of woman or alcohol are gonna fix your problems. You need to find love, which is the final of the three virtues on the album: live, laugh, love, and arguably the most important as explored in Tourmaline, the crown jewel of the album. The album ends with these closing words: "At the end of the day, it's just you and whatever you think. I'm airmailing you strength." And hopefully we've all learned a little something from the wisdom Uncle Sweaty has decided to share with us. Please let me know your thoughts about Earl's new album in the comments below. This video absolutely annihilated me, and it would mean the world if you could like and subscribe. I did not want to make this video a typical X and Y rappers are beefing kind of thing, because that's not really how Earl frames it. he's trying to teach his audience and his listeners these important lessons, and I thought covering it thematically would do right by Earl, Peggy, and you guys, the fans. So I hope I accomplished that, and stay subscribed for more content soon. Go follow me on Instagram and X. We've also got year-end lists coming up soon, and you definitely do not want to miss that. Cheers, gang. Thanks for watching.